And for Ashley McNulty, this year will be unlike any other as she leaves Brisbane behind. 612 Breakfast, Craig and Loretta spoke to the Brisbane Defence spouse about the opportunity she has to take the Aussie Anzac spirit to the battlefields of old.
So this year I am spending Anzac Day in Malaysia in Sandakan. So Malaysia holds a really important part for me in my family. So my pop was a prisoner of war back in World War II, and he was actually a prisoner of war over in Japan and passed through Malaysia. So to go over there and to be a part of it is really important. It's honouring his legacy and the hardship that he endured as a prisoner of war, and that sacrifice really shaped my family story. From my pop, my brother also served in defence and deployed to Iraq, and my husband has been serving for over 2 decades now with multiple deployments over to Afghanistan. So I think it's a really special place because it shaped our family and the legacy that it leaves behind.
Yeah, certainly. You said you're going to Sandakan in Malaysia. What sort of level of involvement will you have in the service?
I'm actually reading a really moving part called Spirit of Place during the dawn service, and it's a really, really deeply moving part. It talks about the sacrifices of the men that fought their countries while leaving behind their families, but it also talks about the local people and what that place means to them. Sandakan, the ground we stand on, has witnessed both the worst of humanity and the best. That place is a really sacred and special place to honour the men that sacrificed, the families who lost everything, and the local people who risked it all to help those men.
That is Ashley McNulty, Defence spouse and Anzac Day representative for this year's service in Malaysia. And today in our humble tin shed in a Brisbane backyard, as the wind whistles and the weather gets a little bit cooler, to keep you warm and inspired, you are joined by an incredible woman. Lynette Ramsey Silver is a history detective, historian, investigative writer and specialist tour guide. She has many publications, recognitions and medals under her belt. She needs a bigger belt for all of those. But her most recognisable work perhaps is her research and investigation into the Sandakan Death Marches, a historical event that is considered one of the greatest atrocities committed against Australia in any war. We're going to be talking deeply about that. Now, through her work, Lynette helped Sandakan get recognised, but that is just the tip of the iceberg of all the things that she has done. Lynette, welcome to the shed.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, Lynette, I've popped the kettle on. Tea, coffee, neither, something else?
If you have it, I'll have black Earl Grey, please, in a nice, fine, proper teacup.
Oh, delightful. No sugar?
No sugar.
Excellent. I love it. That's on the way, Lynette. Now, you are actually an ocean away at the moment. The sheds are connected from Brisbane to Borneo. Can you tell us why you're there?
I've been coming here since 1999, bringing relatives of prisoners of war in a strictly non-commercial capacity so that I can show them the places where their loved ones were and tell the story of what happened to them. So I've brought hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people here, and this will be my 27th year of coming here on Anzac Day.
Talk me about the impact on those family members. I mean, this must be huge. You're not just telling them the story, you are immersing them in the experience of the people that they've lost.
Exactly. I look to see who's coming and see who their relatives are, and I know their backstory. And then I tailor that entire trip to the experience of the people with me. So no trip is ever like another. And the consequences are that I have people who've come with me who haven't been able to say the word Sandakan without crying. And by the time they've finished seeing where their dad or their grandpa was and follow their journey right through to the war cemetery down in Labuan on Labuan Island, they go from a highly agitated, sometimes very nervous state to somebody who has come to terms with what happened and furthermore is actually able to speak about it. They can stand in the war cemetery, never before being able to talk about it without being very upset, and speak about their soldier and what happened to it, and they go home absolutely liberated. They've said to me, if only I'd done done this 10 years ago. And that's why it makes it so worthwhile for me to come across here to give these people the relief they need, an end to the story, so that they can face the reality of what happened and know what happened here and then move on.
Lynette, why did you decide to do this? I mean, there's so many stories within conflicts. One conflict alone, there'll be layers and layers and layers. What hooked you about Sandakan and then these tours to recognise that this was an important way that you could help these family members not move on, but perhaps find some peace or some understanding of their experience?
Well, it started back very long time ago, back in the early 1990s, when I decided to query a long-standing story that the prisoners of war in Borneo had not been rescued because General MacArthur refused to supply necessary aircraft to send in paratroopers. And I looked at that and I found that that was a complete and utter fabrication. And in finding the evidence to prove that that story was not true, I started to uncover records held in archives in Canberra and down in Melbourne, which nobody had looked at since 1945.
Why was there a fabrication in the first place? What was the reason behind the lie?
Because with the British included, we had 2,434 prisoners of war here in Sandakan. And at the end of the war, there were just 6 left alive.
Oh, that is shocking.
So with the British, it was 100% wipeout. With our 6 that survived, it was 99.75% wipeout. And there was a plan to rescue the prisoners of war, and it was completely stuffed up, for want of a better word, by the people collecting the intelligence who relayed information back to Australia in April of 1945, before the rescue was to take place, that there was nobody left at the camp at Sandakan, and actually they were here. The only ones that had gone were a first group that had gone into the interior on what we call the first Death March. They were no longer contactable, but the best part of 2,000 people were still alive in the camp, and we lost them all.
Oh, so the message, mistakenly or otherwise, was sent back to say, no, they're all already gone. There's nobody left here.
Yes, and by the time they found out that that intelligence was incorrect, it was all too late.
Oh, this is such a tragic story, Lynette. So the Sandakan Death Marches, talk us through what that actually looked like. What was actually happening for these prisoners, and why? Why was this taking place in this way, this phenomenally cruel level of loss of life?
The Japanese, after the fall of Singapore, had tens of thousands of prisoners of war they didn't expect to have. So they sent them to various places in their empire to carry out projects. About 2,500 were sent to Borneo to build an airstrip, which was carried out to the Japanese satisfaction. They used it. But then when the Americans retook the Philippines, planes came across and bombed the airstrip out of existence. The Japanese now had all these empty mouths to feed, which was and nothing to do. So they decided to make use of their labour by moving about 450 across to the other side of Borneo, and that is what created the first Death March. The march itself wasn't particularly terrible. It was the conditions at the far end that killed them on the first march. About 3/4 of them arrived at their destination, but by June of 1945, and they'd set out at the beginning of February, there were just 6 left from that group alive.
So why were they walking them from one side to the other, Lynette? What was the idea that they would use that slave labour for on the other side?
The Japanese army was going to use them to carry supplies and just to be general labour force. So the first march set off. It wasn't intended to kill them. It was intended to get them to the other side of the country. There being no air traffic because the Allies controlled the skies, and no sea traffic because the Americans were now controlling the sea lanes. So the only way the Japanese could move anybody was to walk them. The route they followed was cut the previous year as a supply route by local headmen who thought only Japanese soldiers would be using it. And as they loathed the Japanese, who had done terrible things to village people, they routed it the worst way possible, through swamps, up precipitous mountain ranges, across flooded rivers, hoping that they would get rid of some of the Japanese that were in occupation. And to their horror, they discovered at the beginning of 1945, this route they'd cut was going to be used by prisoners of war. So it was a grueling 260-kilometre trek through the jungle with no villages, no backup, no medical equipment, and very little food. Despite that, from the first group that went across, 450 odd, nearly everybody made it, but within months they were all dead except for 6. Meanwhile, back in Sandakan, the food was running out. They were getting very ill from tropical diseases. They had malaria. They were dying like flies, and they probably would have just stayed there until no one was left, except the Allies began a concentrated bombing campaign on Sandakan itself at the end of May. It was designed to divert divert attention from the place of invasion, which was going to take place in June on the western side of Borneo. And the idea was that this was a ploy to make the Japanese think that Borneo would be reinvaded from the east. It worked a treat. The Japanese thought very soon paratroopers would be landing, invasion ships would be coming, and therefore they were not going to leave these prisoners of war behind to make contact with the Allies. They would move them. So although they were in a very poor condition, they were really skeletal, had terrible ulcers on their legs, and they could barely shuffle along, the Japanese moved 536 of them in one batch from one side of Borneo into the middle area, where the others 6 that were still alive were now waiting.
So the people of Borneo, they've discovered that, hang on, this isn't the Japanese, these are these prisoners of war. What does that mean today in Borneo history? What do the Sandakan Death Marches signify in their own history, and how do the people of Borneo feel about what happened during that time?
Well, there's been a huge friendship was forged back in those terrible days, because the locals were suffering terribly under Japanese rule. 15% didn't survive the occupation, and they were very pro-British and very anti-Japanese. So the local people did what they could to try and keep the prisoners of war alive. Slip them food when they could, and when eventually in the last months of the war, few weeks of the war, 6 managed to escape. The local people harboured them at great risk to their own lives until the war was finished and they were able to hand them over to Australian rescue parties. So we've always had this very great connection with the local people, and we still do today.
Lynette Ramsey-Silva on 612 ABC Brisbane. Lynette is a historian, an author, an investigative writer and a specialist tour guide in Borneo right now, as she has been many Anzac days. These 6 men, Lynette, who escaped, helped then by the village people of this region. Tell me about them.
The first 2 escaped fairly early on the Death March, and they managed to make contact with local people who lived along the rivers, who were able to get them across to the Philippines to the Allied forces. The last 4 that escaped continued the Death March and went all the way to the very end, where they started to die in a very fast rate. And eventually they realised that if they didn't escape, they were not going to make it out of the war. So they escaped, got into the jungle, and were looked after by village people who looked after 3 of them for about 5 weeks. They hid them deep in the jungle, built them a little house, and these people are the indigenous people of Borneo called Dusun, and they were responsible for keeping these prisoners alive, which is why we know today what happened. If there had been a complete wipeout, we would have had no idea at all what had actually taken place over in Borneo.
So you found this one little detail where you started tugging at it, essentially. You were like, that doesn't seem to ring true, and you tugged at it and tugged at it until you essentially found this entire story that was, up until this moment in time, hidden. Tell me about that process of having the experience recognised.
Well, I was at it probably from the time I started till I had the book published for about 6 years, and it was pretty much occupied every waking moment. I was going backwards and forwards between archives in Sydney sometimes, but mostly in Canberra down to Melbourne, gathering information, then assessing it and finding out there was a hole here. I'd have to go off and start a new pattern until eventually I had enough pieces in the patchwork to create the picture. And when I realised what I'd found, and I knew that the relatives of these prisoners of war had been deliberately told nothing by the Australian government, other than the person that went off to war died while in Borneo of illness. It was a deliberate attempt, and very successful, by the army and by the Australian government to keep these facts from the next of kin, because they believed that it would be too distressing. Of course, the opposite was true. People want to know what happened. So I can't tell you how many people have contacted me to say, can you tell me what happened to my father? We all believe that he was made to dig his own grave and then was beheaded. Well, that didn't happen to anybody. The last prisoner left alive, very sadly, on the 15th of August, 1945, 5 hours before Japan surrendered, was indeed beheaded to get rid of him. But most of them simply died of starvation and illness, and these people have been imagining for years that all these terrible things happened to their relatives and that they're still lying out in the jungle. They didn't even know that for 6, 7, 8 years after the war, we had teams in Borneo looking for these remains, and they're all buried down in the war cemetery. They don't have a name on them because the victims were only wearing a piece of rag around their middles, but they were all collected, were all looked after, and very, very reverently reburied in a war cemetery where they're all together. But none of this information reached to the next of kin, who only knew that their name was on a wall. Because their name's on a wall doesn't mean they weren't found. The relief of knowing that, grandpa or dad was actually found, the relief is palpable when they find out.
Oh, I'll bet. I'll bet. I mean, it all just makes sense, of course, these decisions that have been made in the past under the guise of protection, just been so devastating and for so long. But Lynette, I mean, your commitment to uncovering these stories and following this through is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, you are a historian, but was it deeper than that for you? Like, why has this particular story struck such a chord with you?
Well, I spent such a long time finding the evidence, and then, I wrote a book which is still in print, Sandakan, A Conspiracy of Silence.
Mm-hmm.
I deliberately called it that because it was a conspiracy of silence at many levels. And I thought that was the end of it. But the next thing, I started to be contacted by all these relatives who heard me talking on the radio, and I realised that the story was far bigger than just writing a book. And then, of course, the next thing that happened, I was asked to bring them over here by a travel agent, which I agreed to do on the proviso that I wasn't paid. It sort of started off little. I didn't think it would go for very long, and here I am in 2026. I started off when I was... I'm not even 60, so I'll be 81 this year, and I'm still at it.
Incredible.
So in this group, I've got 8 members of one family, and 6 of them have come for their great-grandfather.
Yeah.
They need to know, and I'm here, so I might as well help them out.
Just to loop fully back around, to do our best to tie the Sandakan part of this story up as best we can. It's so much bigger than the time that we have, Lynette, but those 6 men who did escape, did any of them come home, or they all lost their lives still in Borneo, but later?
They all came back. They were told to get on with their life and forget about the war. They didn't meet up at any level until the 1980s, and they all had very traumatic lives, really, for the rest of their lives. One was killed crossing the road in 1963 in Melbourne. One who was severely traumatised took his own life. One, unfortunately, died of cancer. And the last 3 lived well into the 1990s, with the third one eventually dying about 2003. And they tried to live fairly normal lives, but they were haunted by this. And I used to talk to them sometimes and see the actual torment in their face and think, it might have been better if you hadn't come back. Because their lives when they got back were completely disrupted and awful. They had nightmares, they had flashbacks. They had not had anyone who understood their story until I came along. And the first time I met Keith, I said, could I speak to him again, because we were at a function where we shouldn't have really been having these discussions. And I said, can we meet up again? He said, yes. Do you know you're the first person I've ever spoken to who knows what I'm actually talking about?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was a huge privilege, to be able to share his experiences on that very personal level.
Did they ever meet up with each other, any of those remaining survivors, before they passed?
They met up for a radio play in 1946 on the ABC. The 6 of them were there. And then it wasn't until the 1980s that Owen Campbell from Queensland and Keith Bottrell, who's a special friend of mine, and Nelson Short, who were the only ones still alive, met up and came back here to Borneo in the 1980s. They went back to see what had happened.
So what was that like for them, to go back?
It took them a while, of course, to come back. I think it was helpful, and they did meet up with the head man of the village that had sheltered them. So they were able to have that reunion, which was very meaningful.
612 ABC Brisbane, Lynette Ramsey-Silva has been our guest in the shed this morning. Massive story, and so many other stories that you've got, Lynette. I mean, Sandakan is not the only bit of research that you've done by any means, and no stranger at all to the stories of war, the stories of battle and operations, but they're stories for another day. As my teacup comes to a finish,